Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Very warm welcome to our webinar today. This is the 11th webinar in the Local and Subnational Government Information Webinar Series. And I just want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to our program today. So today we will be looking at some reflections on the plan of action on subnational governments, cities and local authorities for biodiversity, and some of the recommendations that are coming out of a review that has been undertaken by a few ICLEI and a few of our partners. And these recommendations are for a renewed plan of action. And then we really are thrilled to have our colleague from the Scottish Government with us. I'll introduce her in a second. To provide an overview of the upcoming Edinburgh process. We have an exciting virtual consultation process to share with you today. So before we begin, I just want to cover some logistics. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to all those who have registered in a follow-up email to this webinar. It will also be put on our various YouTube pages. We will open the floor for discussion and questions once we have heard from all of our panelists. So this will happen at the end of the webinar, and we ask that you hold your questions until that point, whereby there are two ways you can ask a question, either by raising your hand in the panel on the right, where we will unmute you, or by making use of the chat and question boxes, also in the panel on the right. So without further ado, welcome to our webinar. This is, in a nutshell, where we situate ourselves in the larger global process and global environment. And this really just highlights the critical moment that we're in 2020, as the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity is coming to an end, and we are seeing the dawn of a new post-2020 framework. So my name is Timothy Blatch. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI Africa and also the Global Coordinator of Cities with Nature. So I work in ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Our panelists, we have a really exciting lineup today. A few of them are no stranger to the webinar series. We have Kobe Brandt, the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the Global Director of ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Center. Joining us, and she's joined us in many webinars before, as well as Ingrid Coetzee, who's the Senior Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions at ICLEI Africa and the Senior Program Manager in ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Center. We also have Mr. Oliver Hillel from the SCBD joining us today, and you may recall that he was unable to join us live in this morning's session, but we had his inputs pre-recorded. But in this session, we are thrilled to have him with us to share his inputs live. And then a very warm welcome to a very special panelist and a partner of ours who we work very closely with, Dr. Susan Campbell, and she's the International Biodiversity Policy Manager at the Scottish Government. And we are working closely with her on the Edinburgh process, and Sue will share some more information on this process later on in the webinar. So a very warm welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you for joining us online today. So just to mention that this webinar is taking place on behalf of the Global Taskforce, for which ICLEI is the focal point to the three Rio conventions, and the relevant convention for this webinar is primarily the CBD, or Convention on Biological Diversity. And also just to situate us within the webinar series, this is our third webinar of the year, but our 11th webinar in the series in its entirety. And this just presents a snapshot of the upcoming webinars for the year. I would like to draw your attention specifically to the upcoming webinar after this on the 14th of May, and we will make the links for registration to those webinars available to everyone. We encourage you to visit our various platforms and to sign up for the entire series so that you can be kept in the loop with the unfolding process as it continues to unfold. So a quick overview of today's agenda. I've covered the opening and welcome and introduced our prestigious panel. We are going to have Ingrid share with us an update on the roadmap and a few of the changes to the timeline due to COVID-19 before Kobie Brandt discusses a really exciting roundtable discussion that we and a few of our partners were involved in. And Kobie will also touch on some of our key ICLEI messaging in this COVID-19 period. Then I'll hand over to Oliver Hillel, who will provide an introduction and a history to the current plan of action that is in effect up until 2020, and will really introduce the need for a renewed plan of action, which will lead very nicely into Ingrid's second presentation, which will be on the recently completed review of the current plan of action. And Ingrid will present some of the recommendations that are coming forward for a renewed and stepped up plan of action to be adopted alongside the new global framework. And what's important to note is that this review of the plan of action, we are soon going to open it up for some inputs and to really consult on that review. And that will primarily happen through the Edinburgh process, where Sue will present today an overview of how that process will work and give us an introduction to the various products that are intended to come out of that process. Thereafter, we will open for some questions and discussion. So in the interest of time, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid. Ingrid, thank you for being with us today. And Ingrid will provide a short overview of the roadmap and the changes. Thanks, Ingrid. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good day to all the participants. So just very briefly, as we saw with our last webinar, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and its spread across the world has had an impact also on major events, particularly for our purposes, those events that relate to the CBD's process around negotiating a new global biodiversity framework. And I just wanted to give you an update of some of the changes. You can see that the red star indicates where we are in the space of time. The ones that I want to highlight to the right of that red star, above the dotted line, you'll see there is a meeting called the SBI3, which is the subsidiary body on implementation. It's a CBD body, and that meeting is going to be taking place at the end of August. And just below it, below the line to the left, the SABSTA meeting, which is the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice, is taking place the previous week. And these are very important meetings in the roadmap towards negotiating and adopting a new biodiversity framework. Also to the right of the SBI3 meeting, the Open-Ended Working Group 3 meeting, which is scheduled to be held in Cali. It's the third of the working group meetings, which are really the positions or places where a lot of the negotiation around the text of the new draft biodiversity framework is being held and discussed and debated upon. That date has been moved forward, but we are waiting for a final notification from the SCBD as to exactly when that'll happen. And obviously, all of these dates moving back have had an impact on the COP15 was scheduled to take place at the end of this year, and that is now no longer going to be possible. As with the climate COP, the dates are being announced, will still have to be announced, but we know that it will certainly take place only next year. And as soon as we get finality around exactly when, there's been some talk about it won't be early in the year, it might be in the sort of from the period from April further on. But the important thing is that the meeting, the COP, is still going to take place, and all of the preparatory meetings have been moved back so that we can continue in the process. Besides the CBD related meetings, there are several other meetings that are also part of this roadmap. One of the big meetings that was planned for this year in May is the IUCN World Conservation Congress, and that has now been shifted to early January next year. There's also a very important meeting, which is the United Nations National General Assembly. Associated with that is going to be a biodiversity summit, which is a very high-level meeting of heads of state and government. And there was a recent notice to say that that meeting has been confirmed on the 22nd of September. And it's an important meeting because it essentially, the focus or the theme of that meeting is going to be around urgent action on biodiversity for sustainable development. So it brings the biodiversity and sustainable development agendas together. And it is a very significant meeting in that it provides an opportunity to demonstrate for these heads of state and government to demonstrate their ambition towards accelerating action, specifically on biodiversity and how this will contribute to the SDG targets being achieved. And it also provides momentum within the wider CBD process around the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Then the ICLEI has a meeting, or it used to be the Resilient Cities Conference. It's now been renamed as the Daring Cities Conference. It was going to take place in June. It's now been scheduled for later this year. A tentative date has been set for October, and the format of these Daring Cities is still being decided. And the idea is to have a very exciting and interactive process, which will be largely online, but also make provision for some very high-level smaller meetings. And as soon as those plans have been finalized, we will share that information. And then in addition to these major events that we've captured in our timeline, I just want to draw your attention also to two forthcoming dates, which are really important for biodiversity. The one is the Biodiversity Day, which will take place on the 22nd of May. And the other one is World Environment Day, which will take place on the 5th of June. The theme this year for World Environment Day is specifically on biodiversity, obviously sort of responding to the super year for biodiversity. And Colombia is being designated as the global host. And we understand from UNEP, who organizes this event, that they are working on some packs for cities, which they will make available in the course of next week. And we will also share links on our websites. And then in relation to both these events, the World Environment Day and the Biodiversity Day, I just want to mention that we're working very closely with the City of Montreal. Many of you know that the Mayor of Montreal, Mayor Valérie Plante, is ICLEI's global ambassador for local biodiversity, and her office have got really exciting plans for both these events. In the June event, World Environment Day, the City of Montreal has been designated as the North American capital, but also on the Biodiversity Day, where the focus is on our solutions are in nature. This is a theme that's very topical at the moment, given the COVID-19 pandemic, and the global community is being called to re-examine its relationship with the natural world through this theme, and to focus also on how we can work together at all levels of society, but also all levels of government, to ensure the future of life on Earth is in harmony with nature, which links up to the theme of the vision of the CBD harmony in nature. So Tim, I think at that I'm going to stop it because I know we have a very full program, but I just want to mention that these are not the only events, these are just some of the events. And I think the important thing is to understand how the organizers and the institutions involved are responding and responsive to the fact that the pandemic is evolving and is shifting, and it affects countries in different ways, and they're trying to accommodate the impacts of the events of the pandemic by having later dates and scheduling different types of events. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Tim. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid, and thank you for your inputs and for updating us on where we are and on the process going forward. Although there are a few shifts and changes, it's great to see that everything will continue, albeit slightly later than planned. And we'll hear later about some of the new and exciting ways in which we are trying to engage virtually. But at this point, I'd like to introduce and hand over to Kobie Brandt, who's going to talk about our ICLEI messaging on COVID-19, a few of our key messages, and also provide some feedback from a World Urban Park Roundtable that ICLEI and partners are involved in. So Kobie, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good day to everybody. So yes, I just wanted to, before I go to the very exciting International Parks panel that we participated in, share with you that Ingrid mentioned it's not all the events that you saw on that timetable. One very important link that is getting stronger by the day is the work between the different conventions, particularly our collaboration with the Climate Convention, the UNFCCC COPs. And as you know, these COPs, the COP for NEC4, which was going to be scheduled for later this year, has been postponed till next year, and probably till quite late next year. But having said that, it's very important to know that at the last climate COP, we had a significant increase in nature and biodiversity related events, which combines both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda as part of one of the same solution to address these two, both the nature crisis and the climate crisis that the world is in. So this convergence is fantastic to see. And although the climate COP is going to be postponed till probably quite late next year, that convergence with the nature agenda is very important. And we certainly are, through our role as convening the subnational and local constituency in the climate space, making sure that those links are kept very strong and very pertinent as we move forward. So I wanted to move on. We can go to the next slide. On the invitation of the World Urban Parks and collaborators that you see on the screen here, ICLEI, through our Cities Biodiversity Centre, also participated about 2 weeks ago in an international experts roundtable around the importance of parks during trying times like what we're facing today. And it was agreed at that meeting that such a forum is especially necessary right now to help provide expert guidance to our subnational and local constituency around the need for people to connect with nature in times like this, when we are facing pandemics and when more than half of the world's population is in some form of lockdown. The link with nature is both healing at so many levels. It provides recreational opportunities, but it's also important for people and communities to stay connected with nature. And parks and open spaces in our cities play a vital role for that human connect with nature. And we know, of course, of the many benefits to the natural world, to our ecosystems, and to biodiversity that parks and open spaces provide in cities. So that was the focus of that panel. But the panel has also agreed that there's a need for ongoing awareness raising and information and sharing the benefits of these parks, making them part of the solution for rebuilding and reshaping when we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also making people aware of the healing role and also the repurposing, probably temporarily repurposing role into virtual hospital or into pop-up hospitals and other functionalities to deal with the crises in different cities as COVID-19 sweeps really literally across the planet. So if we can move to the next slide, this panel agreed, well, here you can see the partners that were all part of the initial partnership, and I want to say that many of them are already collaborators in Cities with Nature, which provides an online platform for cities to connect. These partners all agreed in this panel that there's a need for ongoing efforts in talking about protected areas and parks in cities. And one of the key things that came out was that, yes, there needs to be ongoing leadership and collaboration and advice to cities, but there also needs to be a way that we can share our knowledge and experiences in terms of how parks, what role parks and urban open spaces have played and are playing during the course of this pandemic, and how we can make sure that they form an integral part of the future city that we build post-COVID. We agreed that we will carry on working together and invite other partners on board. And we also agreed that it is really important to have clear and positive and time-sensitive messaging coming out to the world, to our urban communities, in terms of the vital connect in these days. Especially, we also said that in some instances, like in my country, there's a total lockdown and we are not allowed even to visit our parks. Our city parks are all closed, but there are other ways that we can bring parks into the lives of people. And here I want to take my hat off and congratulate cities like London, New York City, and so many others around the world that are sharing videos through social media outlets, etc., that people can still experience virtual walks or recreational activities and enjoy the beauty of nature that these parks provide during these trying times where some people are locked up without even a small backyard to connect with nature physically. At least they can do so virtually. So this work will continue, and we're looking forward, and we'll keep on providing updates as we start disseminating information on that. If we can move to the next slide, I just quickly wanted to focus on what ICLEI, particularly from a nature point of view, is doing. We can move ahead to the next slide. In terms of messaging, and one of the key things for us is that we really understand that this is a crisis that is unfolding and we do not know the answers yet, and the science is working very hard and there's more science coming out daily, but we will need a lot of analysis for years and years to come in order to better inform us and prepare us for a future pandemic, which is definitely also going to happen at some stage. So for now, what we are doing is we are really honing in on very simple and positive messages about the vital connect between nature, health, well-being of communities in an urban context during times like these. The first message is around how nature can and should be part of of overall resilience in an urban context, and those cities that have very rigorous natural and ecological systems are better prepared and responding probably in ways that other cities that do not have that luxury of nature being so part of their urban planning processes are able to do right now. So building urban resilience with nature is a critical key message. The second one is around the protection of nature during times like this, but also the respect of nature, how people relate to nature in a respectful way in terms of what we eat, how we use nature, how we make sure that we have replenishment processes in place in terms of using the natural benefits that we need so vitally in our day-to-day lives. So that is the mutual respect that there needs to be between the provision of natural services towards communities and how communities in return react towards nature. Our other message is around simply that nature is good for you in many ways, at community level and at individual level, at physical level and at spiritual and cultural level. So all these different aspects of the value of nature need to be emphasized, and they can help us cope and heal also during and after such a pandemic as we are facing now. And then lastly, but not least, is that there is a growing need to connect online. People and cities have shown that they really want to connect, and we see it through our initiative Cities with Nature, which is a broad-based partnership initiative which ICLEI is part of. Cities are flocking actually to join Cities with Nature, which is a free and open network, and it just demonstrates that no matter what crisis the world is facing, cities do have a need to stay connected, see how others are responding to issues, see how others are utilizing and optimizing natural benefits, providing the platform for learning and inspiring and reporting actually in what they're doing. And for those who are not yet partners to Cities with Nature, we welcome you on board. And for those cities that are attending this webinar, please, joining Cities with Nature now may hold many benefits also in the months ahead as we collectively face and work our way through the current pandemic. So Tim, I'm focusing on the pandemic today. It was really important to note that we cannot hold a webinar around nature and not speak about COVID-19. I want to wish everybody in this call also strength for what they're going through and what lies ahead. And together, I know with mechanisms like Cities with Nature, we can make sure that people and nature come through this at the other end stronger and closer. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Kobe. Thanks for your valuable inputs as always. And I completely agree with you. This time is really challenging us in terms of our relationship with the natural world. And I think you've rightly pointed out that Cities with Nature provides a way in which we can all remain connected at this time. So thank you for your inputs and for sharing about the exciting Urban Parks panel as well. So our next panelist also is no stranger to these webinars and perhaps needs little introduction, but it's Mr. Oliver Hillel from the SCBD. As I mentioned before, Oliver was unable to join us in person in the webinar earlier, but his inputs were recorded. But we're really thrilled to have him online live with us today. So Oliver is going to provide an introduction and a bit of a background and history to the current plan of action, and also allude to the reasons why we need a renewed plan of action to complement and support the new global framework that is currently being negotiated. So Oliver, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your ongoing support to this webinar process. And at this time, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I hope people are hearing me. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually at this, just like Kobe was saying, this very relevant moment in all of our lives. I want to start with a little joke. I think my picture here tells me two things. I'm much older than I was in this picture, but also my hair is pretty much the same because we can't cut our hair these days. So at least this is in common. My reflections with you today are going to be from the strategy point of the cooperation between national, subnational, and local governments in the convention. And I'd like to go a little bit before the timeline of Ingrid's very good horizon to 2006, when the city of Curitiba, and particularly the mayor of Curitiba, Mr. Beto Richa, hosted the 8th conference of the parties of the convention. And at that year also, ICLEI started its local action for biodiversity project, which was really a pioneer in this area. In 2007, the mayor of Curitiba, with the secretariat and ICLEI, hosted the first meeting on cities and biodiversity. This led to the first parallel meeting of the Conference of the Parties with cities and subnational governments in Bonn in 2008, also hosted by ICLEI and by several others. So that then led in 2010 to the first important, in 2008, the parties already took a decision on the importance of cooperating with subnational local authorities and the importance of cities in implementing decisions. But the big step that the convention took was in 2010 when a plan of action was adopted. And I want to say here, it was such a great job and it was such a novel idea that was so welcomed that not a comma was changed in the draft plan of action that was put towards the parties. So this plan of action ran in parallel to the strategic plan of the convention, 2011-2020. And really, I mean, the adoption of it without a comma was a sign of two things. First, that it was really welcomed and that people endorsed it with their full energy. But second, also, since it was really a draft, that nobody really had an idea what was going to be needed and how exactly this was going to play out. So the draft plan was adopted without a comma because people didn't know a lot. Now, 10 years later, we have learned a lot. I don't want to take too much time here on mentioning things like more than 50% of all the national biodiversity strategies and reports today contain elements for the involvement of local and subnational governments. There was the Singapore Index, there was the Cities and Biodiversity Outlook, there was the Nature and the Urban Century Assessment, there was ICLEI Interact Bio, there was UNA Rivers, there was the Regions for Biodiversity Learning Platform, and the publications of the group of subnational governments for the Aichi biodiversity targets and contributions from the European Union Committee of the Regions. So many things happened meanwhile. But the point is we come now to the moment when, of course, as we know, the global biodiversity framework for the next, not only for the next 10 years, the global framework, as it was just indicated, goes all the way to 2050. So basically all the national governments in the world will agree on what they think should be done about nature in everything. And local and subnational governments just need to be there at a completely different level than they were in 2010. Now, that framework that we're looking at now has a lot of elements already. And I think it was very relevant what Kobe was saying about the importance of green infrastructure and cities, in cities, because that is the one thing that every one of those 196 parties agreed to in target 10 of the global framework, which clearly expresses the need for every party to bring the services and the benefits of nature to people in cities. It says it as clearly as that. So not only that, but this group has already contributed a lot of other elements where the framework touches and cooperates with subnational governments and local authorities. So I think for looking forward, what the review now and the renewed strategy could look at is a whole new approach. I would say at least, maybe we can discuss this later, but I think at least 6 different things need to be imagined. The data cannot be imagined without the contribution of subnational and local governments. The financing and resource mobilization cannot be imagined without that. The harmonization of the various levels of governance has only become more clear and urgent in the emergency we're going through with the virus, and it goes well beyond the virus. The crisis we have now is much deeper than that, and we can see that the harmonization of policies and the role of nature is important in all of them. So now whether this group and then the parties in their discussions will decide to take an entirely new plan of action, or whether you will say, we're still expanding this and we don't need to go back to a full plan of action. We just need to consider 6 or 7 most important things. And, because we don't need a parallel process now, we need to be part and parcel of the whole. This is for you all to discuss, but I think it needs to be transformative, as the global framework is being called to be transformative. And I think in this view, I think I can finish and look forward to this discussion. I think the other interventions were very good. And overall, I think if, again, the role of nature and the contribution of local and subnational governments has ever become clearer in the convention, I think the current crisis just makes it all the more important. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Oliver. Thank you so much for being with us and for giving of your time to make this input. I think where Oliver ended is a really good place to hand back to Ingrid now. Ingrid is going to speak to us about the recently completed review of the current plan of action and some of the recommendations that are emerging for a renewed and stepped up plan of action. So thank you, Oliver, for the background and introduction to this work. And I'm going to hand over now to Ingrid to take us through the review. Over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Tim. And you can move on to the next slide, please. So as Tim has just mentioned, ICLEI has undertaken this review of what was achieved at very different levels under the current plan of action. And I think what is important also about the review is that it's not just looking at the achievements, but it's also capturing what worked in terms of the current plan of action, what were the strengths and what didn't work. And in doing this review, we've had inputs and contributions from several of our partners, but also from other organizations to capture, you know, the breadth and the scope of what has actually been achieved. If you move on to the next slide. I'm not going to go back into so much detail. Oliver has referred to many of these, but some of the highlights that can be attributed either directly or indirectly to the current plan of action being adopted 10 years ago in Nagoya are, you know, it's such an interesting and actually amazing thing to see that the achievements have not just been at the level of cities or just at the level of the national governments, but it has actually been across a very wide spectrum of all levels of government. There's been things that have been achieved at global level, which reinforces the importance of local and subnational governments, but also within other sectors. So for example, there's been some amazing things that have come from the research and academic sector where they've sort of focused their interests and their priorities on specifically what is needed by city administrations and metropolitan governments and other levels of local subnational government. We've also seen that the business sector has come on board. And even in some of the other multilateral environmental agreements, for example, Ramsar agreement has come up with the city accreditation scheme. So it's had a very far-reaching impact. And the types of things that have happened have been from the implementation of multi-sector and complex projects such as the urban natural assets and the lab project and the biodiversity mainstreaming projects that have been funded both by ICLEI and GEF in different parts of this world, to setting up even new institutions, new organizations. I think something that's also really important is that the platform, the Cities with Nature platform, which is, as Kobie alluded to earlier, a joint partnership initiative between IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, and ICLEI, is a platform which has arisen from the increased interest and realization of how important cities are in protecting biodiversity and ecosystem services globally, but then also specifically at the local levels. There's been a plethora of guidebooks that deal with anything from ecosystem services assessment to how to integrate biodiversity into the various planning regimes, right up to NBSAPs, spatial planning, very practical guidebooks and manuals. And something that I find particularly interesting also has that as a result of the focus on cities and the realization of how important they are, we've seen new approaches and methodologies come to the fore that have been embedded in practices and experiences on the ground in cities. And I'm thinking, for example, of the urban tinkering approach, which is something that has come out from a lot of research and work done amongst also through the UNA projects in Africa. Then there's been tools, measurement tools, indicators, reporting tools, etc. Oliver mentioned the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. More recently, there have been other attempts and there are other initiatives on the go. And these are, tools that are specifically becoming more refined and addressing the needs, not just in terms of biodiversity, but also how the climate challenges and the climate or the need for greater resilience is impacting, and how important it is that we look at our nature when we deal with these things. And then we've already had mention about green and blue infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And I think that is particularly interesting because we're seeing increasingly cities realize that the answer to many of their infrastructure and service delivery problems are often very simply managed and corrected and delivered through nature-based solutions and working with nature as opposed to against nature. Tim, if you move on to the next slide, please. And I think then, so what all of this is telling us and what this review has brought out is the fact that it builds a very strong and compelling case to have a dedicated decision on the role and contribution of local and subnational governments under the new framework, but specifically that this should be more ambitious, more focused, more specific, and that there is a need for a much stronger reference to the active participation by local and subnational governments. Now, a lot of what we are looking for or calling for has been developed through the 10-point framework, which ICLEI has developed and first floated at the open-ended working group in Nairobi last year, and we have already reported on that. And Tim, if you move on to the next slide, you will see that a lot of those elements coming out from that 10-point framework are now crystallizing in recommendations around where do we want to see things going forward, whether this is a specific a renewed or stepped up plan of action. The format that this will take, I think, is something that is open for discussion. But what is clear is that there needs to be very realistic and feasible objectives and targets set around how local and subnational governments can make their contributions. And linked to this is the point, the fundamental point, that these levels of government are not any other, they're not observers, they're not other stakeholders, they are an integral part of government. They are part and parcel of government, they have mandates, they're linked to their national governments, and they are in many, many cases often the ones that are at the coalface, where implementation happens and where the first shocks of whether it's disasters or pandemics, etc., are felt. And another point I think that we're making very strongly is the need for, if we recognize that these levels of government are government, then we need to resource them. And this is across the spectrum of not just finance from the public sector sources, but also that we need to make sure that there's an enabling environment and conditions for the private sector to invest more in biodiversity action at the local level. So we're looking at things around mobilization and also the distribution of resources for increased biodiversity action at subnational levels. Oliver referred to the importance of data and information and decision making. I think this is something that is crucial. If we're going to be contributing, we need to know what it is that we're managing, how we're making these contributions, where there is need for corrective action. There's a great need for improved data collection. There's a lot of data at these levels, but it's not always collected in a systematic way. It's not always made accessible to other levels of government and to researchers, and it's an untapped resource that is important. And linked to this issue of information and the contributions made by all levels of subnational government is the need to report on what's happening. So much is happening already, but it goes unreported, so it's unknown. And a platform like Cities with Nature is the ideal platform for sharing this and for measuring it also in terms of what the actions are and how these contribute in a collective way to achieving national on the one hand, but also global targets and objectives. Capacity building is important. There are areas in which cities and subnational governments have very good capacity, but there is a lot of room for improvement. And if we want to up our game and really get to doing transformative things, then we need to also improve capacity. And I think the one thing that we've learned from COVID is the need to become more digital, to become more tech savvy, and how we can utilize the digital spectrum to improve our work in nature and cities. And then finally, I think what is also important is that cities, because they are in touch with the local communities, they are ideally situated to spread the word, to do awareness raising, to educate local communities around how we utilize our resources. Kubi was talking earlier about this is where we eat and we need to respect nature. Cities are excellent vehicles for bringing those messages across to the people that live, work and play in the cities. And then I just want to end off briefly to say that we will be presenting this through the Edinburgh process to get input from the participants at the Edinburgh process with a view to presenting a formal statement at the SPI3 meeting. Thank you very much, Tim.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. Ingrid's done my job for me in that this leads perfectly into our next presenter and our next panelist. So thanks, Ingrid, for that. And to give us an overview of the Edinburgh process and introduction to the Edinburgh Declaration, we're really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Susan Campbell from the Scottish Government. And Sue is the International Biodiversity Policy Manager. And she's going to just guide us through the very exciting and next upcoming process on our timeline and opportunity for everyone to participate and engage in this process. So Sue, thank you for being with us. Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Hi Tim, thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to ICLEI for the invitation to present at this webinar. My colleague John Mowat was talking about this morning, so it's nice that we can participate. Ingrid and Oliver and Kobe have set out quite nicely the background and the reason why we have this process in place. So that's kind of made my job really easy. Thank you for doing that. So the Edinburgh process is the name that we have for the subnational consultation on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. If you can move to the next slide, Tim, thank you. We were due to host a workshop in Edinburgh to hold the consultation. It was, going to be an in-person workshop over 3 days at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. So I'm really sorry that we're not able to host it in Edinburgh at this wonderful botanic garden that we have. But what we've, Kobe and others have described the awful situation that we're in at the moment with COVID-19, and it's having an impact on this process as well as other processes, and so we've had to move this process to an online consultation event. And so the whole consultation process is now called the Edinburgh process. So we'll be having traditional online consultations. We will be hosting information sessions online in different regional time zones. The consultation will be open for around a month, and then we'll be having follow-up webinars to provide information back to participants on what we've done with all the consultation responses. And we'll also be hosting thematic webinars as well through the process. And we'll be doing that over a 2 to 3 month process. and feeding into the Convention on Biological Diversity meetings that previous panelists have described. So the SBSTA and the SBI meetings at the end of August, and then eventually we'll be feeding back to the open-ended working group co-chairs, so that all of the consultations that we're having with subnational actors can be fed back into the CBD process and taken account in the CBD process. So if you move to the next slide, please, Tim. Although the Scottish Government are leading the development of the process, we couldn't do this without the vital international cooperation and collaboration, which Oliver talked so eloquently about. We are working closely with subnational organisations, subnational governments and regional governments, and organisations both within Great Britain, within Scotland and internationally. And we couldn't do that without the expertise of organisations like ICLEI and Regions 4 and others that you see on this slide. And we're really grateful for the input that all of these partners have provided. We recognise that as Scottish Government, we're relative newcomers to the process. So it's great to have the expertise from the CBD Secretariat and from all of these other organisations, and we really couldn't move forward on our own with this. So the aim of the Edinburgh process, as the previous panellists have described, we have basically 3 outputs, physical outputs from the process. The first output will be to gather subnational views on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the associated monitoring framework that is emerging from the discussions from the open-ended working group discussions and the various SBSTA and SBI discussions. And at the end of the consultation process, what we aim to do is feed back the issues and the concerns and the aspirations of the subnational governments, regional governments, cities, local authorities for the framework. And we will be presenting the Edinburgh process consultation report to the open-ended working group chairs. Our second output will be is in providing a consultation, as Ingrid has just described, for an update to the subnational plan of action. And this will be submitted into the CBD process for consideration at SBI 3 at the end of August and for adoption at the COP15. And as Oliver's already described, what that looks like, will come out in the wash. But there is a real aspiration to update the plan of action and to move it forward from the current plan. We're also very keen to develop an Edinburgh Declaration within the consultation process. So this will be to capture the high-level political views of subnational governments, local authorities and cities on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And it's very much our hope that we will be able to capture the main issues for subnational actors and for subnational governments, and indeed any perhaps representatives from state governments that support subnational actions to sign up to this declaration in the lead up to COP15. And throughout the consultation process, what we want to do through this online process is to build a community across the globe of subnational actors, subnational governments, regional governments, city governments, local authorities, and people who are working at the subnational level to really discuss and bring their thoughts, and to set out what are the key issues, what are the key barriers, what are the key enablers that they want to see addressed within the new framework process. And so we'll be introducing the consultation process through an Attendify app, which we hope will be able to develop the community that we are looking to engage. If you move to the next slide, Tim. Thank you. So because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to review our timeline. As I said, we were due to host the workshop at the beginning of April in Edinburgh, and we've had to move it online. I think we're on about Plan C or Plan D, and this is a provisional timeline of the process that we've developed with our partners. The timeline, as you can see, runs from now really right up until the COP15 in Kunming. And it involves Attendify registration. As I said, we'll have the consultation of the zero draft documents, the subnational plan of action, and hopefully the Edinburgh Declaration online and for people to input into. We will be providing regional information sessions online. Our intention at the moment is to provide that in the between the 5th and the 8th of May, and then once the consultation closes on the 29th of May, then we're looking to provide a second regional information session to be able to feed back to anybody, to the subnational contributors to the consultation. And within that period, we are looking to host some thematic webinars as well. And this will be the chance to have some more technical discussions. Tim, can you move to the next slide, please? So we're hoping to host traditional webinar sessions, and you can see the themes that we've set out here. And actually, Ingrid, you talked very nicely and introduced these topics and explained the need to be discussing each of these different topics, which are really important for the subnational input into implementing biodiversity actions. You know, all of these are very important. One of the themes, as you can see, will be around the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, and that was something that Kobe touched on earlier. Ingrid talked about monitoring and reporting tools and how important it is to not only gather the data but report at subnational level, because if you don't report, you can't capture what action is being taken. And then there's obviously the infrastructure and also the finances that are needed in order to put in place nature-based solutions. And Kobe again talked about World Biodiversity Day, and it's our hope that we're able to host our nature-based solutions session on or around World Biodiversity Day. So that's an exciting development for us. Of course, with the timetable, it's not set in stone. It's a provisional timetable because we are where we are with the COVID situation. And but I hope this gives you at least outlines the process that we are have developed with our partners and that we are seeking your input into. If anybody would like any further information about the process, thanks Tim for moving that to the next slide. the email inquiries-subnationalworkshop@gov.scot. If you send your details to that email, we'll be able to make sure that you're registered for the process. And if you'd like further information, please don't hesitate to get in touch with that email address. I'd like to thank everybody for their attention. I'm happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. We really appreciate you being with us and providing a really solid overview of the process that will unfold. So I'd like to just take this opportunity to encourage everyone on the webinar, if you haven't done so already, to express interest with the email address that's on your screen now. And that will provide a way for you to stay up to date as dates shift slightly, or as registration processes and engagement processes open. So thank you, Sue. And at this time, I realize we are running out of time. These webinars are always very jam-packed. But before I open the floor for some discussion, I just want to quickly mention that our next webinar will take place on the 14th of May. And the details to register for that will be circulated in the follow-up email after this webinar, along with the various other documents and details that have been mentioned, including the email address for registering for the Edinburgh process. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor very briefly. We don't have much time left at all. And while I ask if anyone has any burning questions, to either raise their hand or type the question in the questions box. I would like, Oliver has indicated he would like to raise a brief point. So Oliver, over to you while anyone else indicates if they'd like to ask a question. And if you're unable to ask a question now, our details are on the screen. Please do not hesitate to contact us with any queries or questions you may have. Oliver, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim, and I will be brief. I just have three strategic messages on this process. The first one is one of the thematic issues is resource mobilization. I would like to remind us of the importance of that. We have an unprecedented interest from multilateral development banks and from the finance sector on the whole connection of green infrastructure. We should take that advantage to really look into, not because we want to talk about money, but because we want to talk to the people who talk about money. And I think so, therefore, this new interest from the banks and from the finance sector should probably be looked at as a priority. The other two things, technical points I wanted to raise. One is, for the progress in this discussion to become a formal text at SBI 3, there needs to be a coherence process between subnational governments, local authorities, cities, and the parties. So this coordination across parties, I know that many of you are already involved in interactions with the friends of subnational local action group and parties, and I want to encourage this process. It's very important, because the convention has been innovating really in the plan of action. It is the only multilateral environmental agreement, and I say this not with happiness but with sadness. It's the only one that has a legal provision in international law for harmony between all those levels of governance, and we need to keep that. So this articulation should be continued with the parties. And the last point is just that we are called in the Edinburgh consultation to think of what new structures for the next 10 years do we need that don't exist. We should be looking at, right now we have advisory committees of subnational and local governments, but this is not enough. We need probably multi-stakeholder cooperation platforms. We need to build on commitments, work programs, and dedicate resources to that. So I just wanted to remind you of those priorities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Oliver. And the final two questions that we'll look at, the first one is for Sue. Veronica, who's on the line, has asked whether the online consultations are going to be open to other actors and organizations other than the ones stated as partners in your presentation. So Sue, I don't know if you very briefly want to just address that, who the process is open to.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so our partners are helping us organize the process, but really organisations at subnational level, whether you're a city, whether you are a region, whether you might be an NGO working with subnational actors, or we really need to hear from as wide a range of people as possible, so that we can collect really a global we can collect globally what really needs to be done for you in your local area, and feed that back to the CBD. It's very important. Yes, so not just the organisations that were named. Thanks, Tim.
Great, thank you, Sue. I think this online process allows us to open the consultation up much broadly, more broadly, to a much wider range of stakeholders. So Veronica, I hope that answers your question, and please do get in touch to be kept updated. The final question, and I'm going to open it, I think, either to Kobe or to Oliver, is from Katya, and Katya is asking, on sustainable finance, have you heard about any local governments that are thinking about issuing COVID recovery bonds as possible solutions? So in one sentence or so, are either of you able to respond?
I can respond very briefly from our side. Yes, we are starting to see a lot of discussion amongst our ICLEI membership and our other city networks that we engaged with in terms of opening blended finance options, including catastrophe bonds, and looking at how green bonds could be restructured. And these finance options are ongoing and they're very current at the moment. So maybe for a future webinar, that could be a focus area. And thanks for that question. If you have any news from your side, please also share with us.
Great.
Yeah, and maybe a quick comment from my side is just to add that I think you hit the right point. I have heard about those kind of funds, and I think mixed and blended recovery finance with a green thumb is exactly where we need to go. So very good question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. We've completely run out of time. In fact, we've gone over time, but thank you. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's participated and everyone who's online for your questions and for continually supporting this process. We hope that you'll join our next webinars in the series. And I want to just quickly give a special thank you to our panelists, to Kobe, Ingrid, Oliver, and Sue. Thank you for your time and for your support and for being with us today. On that note, I'm going to close the webinar, and I hope that everyone continues to remain safe and healthy, and we will all get together next time on the 14th of May. So thank you, everyone, and on that note, we will close.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tim. Bye-bye.